So in the last tutorial, I showed you how to make a realistic, in fact, a brutally realistic pencil in Blender, and now by popular demand, in which I mean, I didn't read any of the fucking comments. I don't know if people actually want it or not. I'm gonna teach you how to actually animate this thing and make it draw on surfaces and stuff like that, which is cool, because it indirectly shows you how to use dynamic paint, which is always a good thing. So at this point, you should already have a pencil. If you don't, go back to the first tutorial, spend 30 minutes of your life, your valuable time, learning how to make this, and then we'll be ready to proceed. So again, Blender 2.92 if you're using 2.94 or 2.94 ABC. All of it's fine, okay? So first thing we're gonna do is once we have this pencil, again, I set it up so that the origin is at the tip, which is actually gonna be useful for this tutorial. I didn't do it for no reason, right? This is gonna let us animate it from that pivot point. Once you have that pencil, we need to draw, or actually add in a drawing surface, okay? I'm gonna use a piece of paper. You could use a sphere, you could use whatever you want, okay? I'm just gonna scale it up and kind of resize it until it looks like a piece of paper, and once you're at this point, we are ready to actually do this. So, the way we're actually going to get this to draw, and by that I mean procedurally, we can change the animation at any point and it's going to redraw, which is cool. The way we do that is you select your surface. This is what we're drawing on. We're going to call that the canvas. Select your canvas, okay? And then go to dynamic paint and turn this into a canvas object. In other words, when we use dynamic paint, in other words, this object, this pencil painting on this is going to be the canvas, and this pencil is going to be the dynamic paint brush, okay? So we have a brush and we have a canvas, and when we animate this, you're going to see that nothing happens. But let me just prove it. So we take a pencil, we animate the locations. I'm just hitting I to keyframe. Let's say we go 30 frames down and do another keyframe. Well, we have an animation, but you see it's not actually drawing anything. So question is, how do we get this to work? Well, a couple issues. First of all, if we go to our dynamic paint canvas, it is calculating. It is calculating all this interaction. However, we have no way to visualize this, right? We have a paint layer, we have a wet map layer. We're not going to be using that WAP wet layer, just get rid of that. We have a layer, but it's not actually being sent anywhere. So first of all, if it's red, that means there's an issue. Get rid of it. You can either use a custom layer, or if you don't have one, just click add, and it's going to add a layer. It's going to be called color or whatever you rename it to, okay? Okay, so this is where the information's being sent to the color layer. If we even want to have a chance of seeing this, you go to shading, and then for the plane, the material for it, so we can see it, you make a material, and then you go to Vertex Color. Again, that's what we are emitting to with this paint map layer. Vertex Color, visualize this, set it to the same thing, okay? So now we have a chance to make this work, but it still isn't working. Why is that? Well, the way that Vertex Color works is it uses vertices, right? In other words, if we don't have a lot of geometry, in this case we have 1, 2, 3, 4 vertices, we're not going to get much action, okay? So we actually need to increase our resolution, but in the sense of geometry, okay? So I'm going to select this face and just subdivide a couple times. And this is kind of a strange concept. If you haven't done this before, you can see it's already starting to emit. It's using Vertex. It's kind of like a very fancy Vertex paint. I mean, it is Vertex paint, right? But it's dynamic. That's why it's called dynamic paint. And you can see now it's kind of working. It's kind of making little smidges here. This is like the guy in class who has a shaky hand who has to bring in a laptop, right? Because, you know, he types better than the thing. Nobody can read his handwriting. I actually had a friend like that, but you know, that's the situation right now. How do we make this look better? Well, first of all, you know, we could always increase the resolution, although at this point, the more subdivisions you do, the crazier it gets. And you can see it does make those dots smaller and more precise, but there's still kind of gaps in between. Why is this happening? The reason it's happening is basically this calculation's happening in real time, and it's happening kind of once per frame or once every couple frames or something. Which means that there's going to be gaps. The way we fix this is with our canvas. You go to SubSteps, in other words, steps in between steps, do extra frames between scene frames to ensure smooth motion. You take it and you max it out. I think the number's 20, but let's try 1,000. Yeah, it just rounds to 20. And you can see when we do this, it's already going to give us a smoother line. There's a couple other tricks, you know, that you can have in your belt that you can pull out when it's time to, you know, I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about, but there's a couple other tricks like adding in more geometry, dipping this mesh a bit lower so it's kind of going through the plane, or maybe even parenting like a sphere as our brush to the motion. You could do all this kind of stuff, but SubSteps are the first thing, okay? So now that we have this dynamic layer that, again, is changing per frame, right? It's not the same at every frame. We can actually incorporate this into our material, okay? So I'm going to be using this BSDF as our, paper, roughly. And we can use the alpha of this, in other words, where are we actually painting, as a mix RGB factor, okay? So alpha is going to be our mix RGB factor, which is going to be our base color. In other words, this is going to drive the color of this BSDF material. We're going to have one of these colors be probably the other way around. We're going to have one of these be white and one of these be black, okay? So you can see now it's drawing in a line, although it's not that intense. To make it more intense, you make the factor stronger. So you take the math, you multiply it by, 10. And if it makes it like a bit thicker because there was this like gradient before that, it's just kind of clamping everything above. If you have this issue, what you can do is you can switch to power, make this a big number. And basically what that does mathematically is it takes any number that's even relatively close to 1 and just pushes it there when you take a big power. Or maybe it's the other way around, I don't know. This makes our fall off less intense. You can also do this with a color ramp, and then after you do that, you do the multiplication. And you can see that gives us a nice thin line. And again, this entire thing is procedural, right? At any point, we can change the thickness of this by changing the power, and it's still going to be working. We can even like modify things like roughness, right? Like I think where you draw, technically, is supposed to be a tiny bit shinier. So what you could do, and this isn't like a great example of this, but you could take the alpha, you could invert it. So now, I think, yes, so now it's going to be a roughness of 1 on the whole paper except here, where it's going to be perfectly shiny, roughness of 0. And you can kind of tell that it's kind of like a perfectly reflective surface in that area. This is more for paint, but just so you know that that's a thing you can do, okay? So at this point, we have a procedural drawing thing, but how do we kind of make it more procedural in the sense that I don't want to animate, I just want a path and the pencil should follow it. And second of all, how do we make our pencil not look stupid like it's just gliding through time, right? This is the kind of animation you go back to those 80s movies, you're like, wow, this was bad. How do we do all those things? Well, first of all, let's make this a custom path, not an animation. To do this, I'm going to get rid of these keyframes. And by the way, this is going to introduce some extra problems that we're going to solve later. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in a curve. I have all of these because I have the extra curves add-on. If you don't, just go to Bezier, as the French would say. By the way, if you haven't seen Zebra Zone, that's a French channel. Really good. Either way, add in your Bezier curve. This is just going to define, you can just go into edit mode and do all this stuff. This is just going to define the path for where this pencil is going to go. Okay. Once you have this path, whether it be a circle, you write out some text, right? The point of it is it's procedural. You can actually just like, extrude this and add in more points. But once you have done that, take your pencil, go to constraints. So we're going to make it follow the path of this. So now as we like animate this value, it will go along a custom path, okay? So the way this works, hover it, hit I, hover over it, and hit I to add a keyframe. And then on frame 40, let's say, I think you go to -100 if you have your orientation mixed. So let's see. Yes, now it's going like that. Cool. However, even though this is a very modular in the sense that we are procedural, since we could change it at any point, you're going to see it introduces a new issue, right? It still has our material, but the stuttering is back. So how do we get rid of the stuttering? Well, the issue with the stuttering at this point is we've kind of exhausted our tricks, right? Like we already have our SubSteps high. We have a lot of geometry. Let's visualize it. We can add in a bit more, and of course that's going to help. But let's disable overlays. You can see it helps, but there's still a bit of like skipping around. So how do we not make this a million polygons and still get like a nice thing on whatever path we use, okay? The answer is we need to change our brush. And you could either do that directly from here. So in the brush settings, in other words, the pencil settings, I'm going to go to the source, in other words, what is doing the drawing. And instead of mesh volume, which is literally going to look at this intersection at the very tip, instead of doing that, change it to, I guess a couple of these work. Proximity is probably pretty good, although it's going to be hella thick. You can see in some sense that solves the issue. I think we can do this in look dev mode as well. Yeah, that will be a bit faster, but you can see kind of solves the issue, but it makes it like really thick. So to solve this, I'm going to take the distance. Again, proximity, which is the setting we have, basically says if a vertex is within a distance, a proximity of this number, make it black with this kind of fall off, right? So I'm just going to make that fall off smaller, or that radius smaller. And you can see that kind of helps. And by the way, if you're seeing this jaggedness and you're like, oh, why is it doing that? It's going along a curve. It's because your curve needs to have some like more divisions, right? So you can just bump that number up. And now you can see it's going to have a much nicer path. So again, the answer for, not taking it to 1,000,000 polygons is you want to change the type of drawing, right, in dynamic paint. So again, it's proximity. Although again, if you make it too low and you want it to be nice and thin, eventually you're going to run into stuttering again. But for now, it's fine. Another trick, by the way, if you still want to use mesh volume, I already referenced this, but we can just Shift S, cursor to selected. So now whenever we spawn in an object, whatever that may be, a monkey, whatever, it's going to be spawned there. The other ways, you just spawn in like a cube or something, you parent it so it's moving with it, and then you make the cube a mesh volume brush. I'm not going to do it that way. Let me actually just get rid of this cube. Right, I'm not going to do it that way since proximity works, but, it's just something to think about, okay? And I'm pretty sure the way this works, even with the follow path constraint, is we could literally just take a vertex. I'm going to extrude it. I'm going to do some rotation, and I'm just going to modify this path. That, again, we just need to recalculate, but once we do that, you can see it draws along this new path. Okay, next thing to consider is the pencil is just kind of like, it's doing this thing. Well, first of all, we can make it face the direction. I haven't tested this, but I think if you make it follow path, you can follow curve. There you go. And now the pencil should be changing directions based on this. So let's see. Yeah, you can see the pencil kind of like swivels around. So that's a thing you could do. I don't know much about most of these. You can change the orientation. I wouldn't recommend it because it seems to break things pretty easily. But you can do that kind of stuff. But to make it look like it's writing, you need it to wiggle a bit, okay? To do that, we're going to add in a rotation keyframe. Again, rotation is what's going to make it look like it's writing. Add in a rotation keyframe. The reason we do this is when we go to the graph editor now, you're going to see we actually have XYZ, or actually ZYX, but XYZ rotation stuff. If we didn't have this keyframe, right, we delete keyframe. It's not going to be there. Add in a keyframe. So now we can access these settings, and I want to animate, which one is it? It's not X, because that's just going to make it rotate around its like pivot. I guess it's Z is going to make it look like it's writing, or maybe Y. Let's start with Z. You take one of the rotations that you want to animate. We're going to hit N for properties, modifiers, add in a noise modifier. And you can see this is already going to add in a bit of shake. We can make it more visible by, first of all, kind of decrease. So this first strength number is going to be kind of like the speed of this. So it's the strength of how fast is this, noise going back and forth. So you can see it's doing a bit of shake. But the second strength one is how big is the amplitude, right? How much is that motion going to be? So you can see when we do this, it adds in, it does it after the fact as well once it's done, but it adds in a bit of rotation. Couple things to make it a bit nicer. We can make the speed, again, a bit bigger, which means like a larger phase, like a bigger gap, but not literally phase since there's a thing for that. And we can also add in a bit of depth, which just adds in a bit more like precise jitter to this. If you don't want this to go past frame 40, which is when we're done, you go to restrict frame range and you say end it at frame 40. And then you can see this noise is kind of constrained to this. And the nice thing about this is if we change the offset, we can get different animations just by changing like a seed value, for example. And then you could just copy this modifier, go to the, I think it was a Y rotation, paste it, choose a different phase or offset or something, and now it's animating on both axes. So it's going to look like it's writing, but again, this part's all superficial. What actually matters is the dynamic paint layer that is driven by dynamic paint, but is actually visualized, right? The reason we see it is because of the material of the paper. So things to remember, vertex resolution is going to be your texture resolution, weirdly enough. Also, I was about to go over things you should know. But also something I didn't mention because it's not very useful for a pencil where nothing wears away. But if you're doing this with a paintbrush or something, and you could do this very well with a paintbrush, the reason they might use a wet map is it's kind of the same thing, but the difference between a paint layer and a wet map, we'll see if I can visualize this. I think the difference between them is one kind of wears away, like it kind of the paint dries after a while. We'll see if we're actually able to see it. So let's see. So it paints it, and then if you wait long enough, some of this paint should fade away, and it's actually driven by, I think, this dissolve thing. So if we enable that, should go away after a while. I don't know. I don't mess around with dynamic paint too much, but if you want like dynamic effects with like spreading and with drying and stuff like that, this is the way you do it. So let's try spread. See if it works. Yeah, there you go. So you can see now it's actually spreading. And again, this is all procedural, but if we visualize it this way, we got to use the color as the factor now. You can see it's doing this kind of dissolving effect from what I was mentioning before, but it's also doing this kind of spreading, which maybe is better to look at in look dev mode. So this is more if you're doing different kind of paint effects, and there's a guy who does, I think like lava effects this way or something, but there you go. It's procedural. You can change the path. If you want it to be text, you just make a Bezier curve that looks like text, or you can import a curve using an SVG, I think, from like Photoshop or something. But either way, that's roughly how you do the drawing thing. Yeah, I mean, there's more to it, but whatever. Hopefully you enjoyed this tutorial. Hopefully you learned something. And at this point, what are you seeing on the right? Is it a list of... God, is it a list of contacts on my phone? No, it's a list of patrons, something like 690 or something. It's fucking ridiculous. I want to say thank you to the patrons. That's why you're in the credits. These tutorials would not be possible, at least at the frequency they're coming out, without you. So I want to say thank you, but also for people who are not on the Patreon, why would you want to join? Well, first of all, I always upload blend files. Like, for example, I'm going to make a test file that you can use here. It's going to be available, but also any other blend I've ever created, you can get with a 1-month subscription, right? You get access to all of them. So you can get blends, you can get exclusive tutorials that you do not get access to on CG Matter or Default Cube. Those are exclusive. Those tend to be like tutorial series once or twice a month, but they're way longer than usual. And for this month, I'm thinking about making a video game in Unity. So like if you want to learn how to make a very simple video game from the perspective of somebody who barely knows how to code, but in a sense that's good because I'm not going to confuse you with shit. This is literally how do you go from Blender to Unity and make a tiny game without overwhelming you. That's going to be there. Additionally, behind the scenes, early access, stuff like this, all of them available on Patreon at different tiers. So check that out if you're interested. There's a link in the description. And if you're not, don't check it out. It's literally that simple. But there you go. You make the material, you make the dynamic paint, you're golden. Hopefully you enjoyed this. And if you didn't, well, you stuck around till the end.